On August 18, 1634, in a public square in France, a man is tied to a stake while thousands of people watch. He is not an ordinary criminal. He is a Catholic priest, educated, respected, and he is about to be burned alive for witchcraft. His crime, having demonically possessed 17 nuns inside a closed convent, without ever having set foot inside it. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't the execution itself. It's what happened afterward. Because even with her ashes scattered to the wind, the demons didn't leave the convent. The nuns continued to convulse, speak in strange tongues, and shout blasphemies, for 4 more years. This is the story of one of the most documented mass possession cases in history. A case with thousands of pages of legal testimony. Hundreds of witnesses. And 0 definitive answers. Welcome. I'm David, and today we're going to explore a case that has fascinated historians, psychologists, and paranormal researchers for almost 400 years. Loudun Possessed case is not just a story of demonic possession. It's a political thriller, a human tragedy, and depending on who you ask, it could be genuine evidence of supernatural forces, or the most brutal example of how power can destroy an innocent person. It all began in September 1632, in a small town called Loudun, located in the Poitou region of France. A place that was about to become the epicenter of one of the most controversial events in European history. What's fascinating about this case is that you don't have to believe in anything to find it terrifying. The documented facts alone are unsettling. The political implications are chilling. And the unanswered questions, well, those will haunt you. But before we get to the possessions, we need to understand the context. Because what happened in Loudun didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a specific time, in a specific place, with very specific people. And when you know the context, everything becomes much more disturbing. Imagine France in 1632. The country is under the reign of Louis XIII, but the real power lies with one man, Cardinal Richelieu. If you've seen The Three Musketeers, you know him. He's the villain. And in real life, he wasn't much different. Richelieu has a clear objective, to consolidate the absolute power of the French monarchy. And to achieve this, he is systematically demolishing the fortifications of towns that could challenge him. Loudun is one of those towns. It has defensive walls. And Richelieu wants to tear them down. But there's a problem, Loudun is divided. On one side are the Huguenots, French Protestants, who want to keep the walls for protection. On the other are the Catholics, who support the king and Richelieu. It's a town in constant tension. Catholics versus Protestants. Royalists versus autonomists. And in the midst of it all, there's a priest who's about to become the most hated man in France. Urbain Grandier was born around 1590. He was an educated man, a brilliant orator, and by all accounts, extremely attractive. In 1617, barely in his early 20s, he was appointed parish priest of the Church of Hysteria du Marquet in Loudun. And he quickly gained a complicated reputation. On the one hand, he was a charismatic preacher. His sermons filled the church. He was respected for his intellect. But on the other hand, let's just say Grandier didn't take that vow of celibacy very seriously. Grandier had multiple relationships with women from the town. One of them, Philippa Trinquant, was the daughter of a close friend, Louis Trinquant, the king's prosecutor in Loudun. It was rumored that Grandier had gotten Philippa pregnant. When Trinquant discovered the relationship, he became Grandier's mortal enemy. But that wasn't all. Grandier also became the lover of Madeleine de Brou, a young orphan from the nobility. And for her, he wrote a short manuscript arguing that priests should be allowed to marry. Imagine the scandal. A Catholic priest, in the midst of the Counter-Reformation, arguing against celibacy. His enemies multiplied rapidly. And then there was the political problem. Grandier was publicly opposed to Richelieu. He didn't want the walls of Loudun demolished. And it was rumored that he had written a satirical pamphlet mocking the cardinal. By 1632, Urbain Grandier had powerful enemies. The king's prosecutor, whose daughter had seduced. Several local monks, envious of his popularity. The Capuchin friars of the town, whom he had offended. And potentially, the most powerful man in France, Cardinal Richelieu. He only needed one more enemy. And he was about to get it. Outside Loudun stood a convent of Ursuline nuns. Young women from noble families, dedicated to education and religious life. In 1627, a new nun arrived from Poitiers to become their leader. Her name, Jeanne de Belsier. Her religious name, Jeanne de Angers. Jeanne was born on February 2, 1602, into an aristocratic family. But her childhood was traumatic. An accident left her with a permanent physical disability, a visible hunchback that caused her shame throughout her life. Her family, not knowing what to do with a disabled daughter, sent her to a convent. Not because of any religious vocation, but because there was nowhere else for her. By 1632, Jeanne de Angers was the mother superior of a small convent with 17 nuns. The average age was 25. They were young. Many were there not by choice, but due to family pressure. And here's the detail that changes everything: Jeanne de Angers was obsessed with Urbain Grandier. I had never met him personally. But I had heard about him. The handsome, eloquent, charismatic priest. And in her autobiography, yes, she wrote an autobiography, Jeanne admitted something disturbing. When I didn't see him, I burned with love for him. And when he appeared in my thoughts, I lacked the faith to fight the impure impulses I felt. Jeanne de Angers, the virgin nun consecrated to Christ, was in love, or at least obsessed, with a priest who had never entered her convent. And then, in May 1632, something terrible happened in Loudun. A plague epidemic broke out in the town. By September, it had killed 3,700 people. The doctors fled. The wealthy locked themselves in their homes. And the convents sealed their doors. The Ursuline nuns were completely isolated. No visitors. No regular confessor. Locked in a building with 17 young women, in a town terrified by death. And that's when the night visits began. It is September 22, 1632. Midnight. In the Ursuline convent, 3 nuns wake up almost simultaneously. Jeanne de Angers, the prioress. Colombier's sister, the sub-prioress. And Sister Martha de Saint Monique, a young nun. All 3 women reported the same thing: a man dressed as a priest appeared in their rooms. He spoke to them. He asked for their help. At first, they think it's Father Mousant, the convent's former confessor, who had recently died. Perhaps his spirit cannot rest. Perhaps he needs prayers. But the visits continue. During the following weeks, the nuns began to report strange phenomena. They hear voices in the night. They feel physical blows from invisible sources. They suffer uncontrollable fits of laughter during prayers. They wake up with unexplained bruises. And then, things become physical. In October 1632, during a prayer session, Jeanne de Angers extended her hand, and witnesses saw thorns literally appear in her palm. As if an invisible hand were placing them there. And then the convulsions begin. Imagine the scene: one by one, the nuns begin to suffer violent attacks. Their bodies arch backward in anatomically impossible ways. They scream. They blaspheme. And according to witnesses, they speak in languages they had never studied. The convent chaplain, Canon Jean Mignon, who happened to be the nephew of Louis Trinquant, Grandier's enemy, decides that this is not a natural illness. It's demonic possession. And so, on October 5, 1632, the first exorcisms began. Now, here's where things get really strange. Because these exorcisms aren't done in private. They're done publicly. Thousands of people are starting to arrive in Loudun to see the show. And that's exactly what it is, a show. The nuns are brought before crowds. The exorcists, mostly Capuchins and other enemies of Grandier, begin asking questions, and the nuns, supposedly possessed by demons, answer. And here's the twist: when asked who possessed them, the demons give a name. Urbain Grandier. The priest Jeanne de Angers had never met. The man who had amassed so many enemies. That Urbain Grandier. According to the demons speaking through the nuns, Grandier had made a pact with the devil and had sent demons to the convent to torture the consecrated virgins. But here's the problem, Grandier had never set foot inside that convent. Jean d'Angers admitted it. They had never met in person. So how exactly had he possessed them? The exorcist's answer was simple, witchcraft from a distance. And with that accusation, Urbain Grandier's fate was sealed. When news of the possessions reaches Paris, something interesting happens. Cardinal Richelieu, the most powerful man in France, the man Grandier had publicly criticized, decides to get personally involved. Richelieu sends a man named Jean de Laubardemont to Loudun. His connection to the case? He is a relative of Jean d'Angers, the head nun. On May 31, 1634, Laubardemont arrived with a decree from the council signed by the king. This decree did something unprecedented. It gives Laubardemont absolute power over the case. It prohibits the parliament in Paris from intervening. It prohibits any legal appeal. It establishes the death penalty for anyone who publicly debates the case. Read that again. The French government had just made it illegal to question Grandier's possessions or trial. This is no longer a case of demonic possession. It is a political execution disguised as an exorcism. In November 1633, Urbain Grandier was arrested and taken to Angers castle. What follows is difficult to describe without feeling repulsed. First, they shave him completely. Head, beard, entire body. Why? Because according to the witchcraft theories of the time, witches hid marks of the devil under their body hair. Then they bring in a man named Dr. Mannery, a supposed expert in identifying witches. Mannery begins pricking Grandier's entire body with needles, looking for places where Grandier feels no pain. Because supposedly, those would be the marks of the devil. They found several. It was later discovered that Mannery used retractable needles that didn't actually penetrate the skin. He was a fraud. Then come the official tortures. They systematically break his legs. They demand that he confess. That he admit his pact with the devil. Grandier never confesses. Not once. But the inquisitors have their star piece of evidence, a document. According to accounts, during one of the public exorcisms, the demon Leviathan, supposedly possessing Jean d'Angers, was ordered by the exorcist to produce physical proof of Grandier's pact with the devil. And miraculously, a document appeared at the bishop's feet. The document is written in backward Latin. It is signed in blood. And it says, "We, the Almighty Lucifer, seconded by Satan, Beelzebub, Leviathan, Elemi, Astaroth and others, have today accepted the pact of alliance with Urbain Grandier, which is ours." It is signed by supposedly all the demons of hell, and by Urbain Grandier. Now, think about this logically. If you were Urbain Grandier and you had actually made a pact with the devil, would you sign it with your real name? And would you write it in such a way that anyone could use it as evidence against you? Modern analysis of this document has revealed numerous irregularities. The handwriting does not match Grandier's. The signature appears to be forged. But in 1634, this document was presented as definitive proof. Grandier's trial lasted 18 days. The records filled 5,000 sheets of legal paper. The evidence against him consisted of the testimonies of the nuns during the possessions, i.e., the demons accusing him. The forged pact. Testimonies from his personal enemies about his immoral conduct. And basically, nothing more. There was no physical evidence linking him to the convent. There were no witnesses to any act of witchcraft. There was nothing except the accusations of the possessed nuns and a document that was likely a forgery. The Archbishop of Bordeaux tried to intervene. He ordered the nuns to be separated and kidnapped. When they were separated, the possessions temporarily disappeared. But Richelieu wasn't going to let that ruin his case. On August 15, 1634, Urbain Grandier appeared before the judges for the last time. He was found guilty of witchcraft, making a pact with the devil, and causing the demonic possession of Ursuline nuns. The sentence was clear: Grandier was to be burned alive. But first, he had to make honorable amends. He had to kneel in front of the churches of Loudun, with a rope around his neck, holding a candle, and ask forgiveness for his crimes. On August 18, 1634, Grandier was taken to the public square. Thousands of people gathered to watch the execution. Some believed he was guilty. Others thought it was an injustice. According to records, many in the town said the whole thing was a hoax, a fraud. Grandier was tied to the stake. Firewood and straw were piled around him. According to witnesses, even with broken legs, even after weeks of torture, Grandier never confessed. He maintained his innocence until the very end. And then, they lit the fire. The chronicles say that Grandier died shouting his innocence as the flames consumed him. His ashes were scattered to the wind. And this is where the story should end. An innocent man executed for crimes he never committed. A brutal but complete injustice. Except that, it didn't end. Because the demons didn't leave. Here's the detail no one expected: after Grandier's execution, the possessions continued. If Grandier really was the sorcerer who had caused them, his death should have freed the nuns. But it didn't. Jeanne d'Angers and the other nuns continued convulsing. They continued screaming in strange languages. They continued blaspheming. The exorcisms continued. Publicly. With thousands of spectators. And that's when a new exorcist arrived. A man who would change everything. Jean-Joseph Surin was a young Jesuit, barely 34 years old. He was known for his compassion, his deep faith, and his radically different approach to exorcism. When Surin arrived in Loudun in December 1634, he rejected public and violent exorcisms. Instead, he sat quietly with Jeanne d'Angers. He read prayers to her. He spoke gently to her about finding inner peace. And then Surin did something that modern theologians consider problematic. He offered to take upon himself the evil that afflicted Jeanne. He asked the Divine Majesty to let him bear her demons. And apparently, her prayer was answered. During the following weeks, while Jeanne d'Angers began to show improvement, Surin began to deteriorate. First came hallucinations. Then seizures. After that, episodes of temporary paralysis. Surin began to experience intense suicidal urges. He felt he was eternally condemned. Gradually, he lost the ability to speak. Jean-Joseph Surin spent the next 20 years in this state. 2 decades of mental and physical torment that he attributed to having taken on Jeanne's demons. Only in the last years of his life, before he died in 1665, did he recover enough to write about his experience. And he wasn't the only exorcist who suffered. Father Lactance, another exorcist, died within 30 days of the trial, reportedly shouting on his deathbed, "Grandier, I was not responsible for your death." Father Tranquil, who had been the most aggressive of the exorcists, died insane 5 years later. And Dr. Mannery, the man who had tortured Grandier with fake needles, also died in delirium. One by one, the men who had participated in Grandier's conviction suffered terrible deaths or mental breakdowns. Guilt? Coincidence? Or something more? But the story of Jeanne d'Angers took a completely different turn. In 1635, a year after Grandier's execution, Jeanne reported that she had been miraculously marked. The names Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and Father Sales appeared on his hands, written in bloody crimson. Some witnesses said the marks were bleeding. Others said they looked like tattoos. Skeptics suggested Jeanne had inflicted them on herself with acid or inks. But the Catholic Church declared it a miracle. Jeanne d'Angers became a celebrity. She traveled throughout France, displaying her scarred hands to crowds. She was received by Queen Anne of Austria. She was considered a living saint. The same woman who had publicly blasphemed, who had accused an innocent man, who had been possessed by demons, was now venerated as an example of divine grace. Eventually, Jeanne returned to the convent in Loudun. She lived there quietly until her death in 1665. In her later years, she wrote an autobiography in which she admitted, with surprising honesty, her manipulations and her obsession with Grandier. But by then, nobody was paying attention anymore. The end of possessions. The possessions at the Loudun convent finally began to decline around 1638. 6 years after they began. 4 years after Grandier's execution. Why did they stop? Nobody knows for sure. Some say the nuns simply grew tired of the spectacle. Others believe that with the death and decline of so many exorcists, the church quietly decided to close the case. And some believe the demons simply left when they had completed what they came to do. But the question remains, what exactly were they? What evidence do we really have? Now, let's talk facts. Because unlike many paranormal cases, the Loudun possessions are exceptionally well documented. Have 5,000 pages of trial records. Multiple pamphlets published by exorcists in 1633 to 1634. The complete autobiography of Jean de Angers, written years later. Letters from Jean-Joseph Surin describing his experiences. Chronicles from contemporary observers, both believers and skeptics. Official documents of the Catholic Church. This isn't a case of someone saw something strange and told someone else. It's a massively public event that took place over years, in front of thousands of witnesses, and is thoroughly documented. So, what do we know for sure? The confirmed facts. Fact 1, the nuns exhibited extreme behavior. Violent convulsions, bodily contortions, screaming, blasphemies. This was witnessed by hundreds of people during public exorcisms. Fact 2, multiple witnesses reported that the nuns spoke in Latin and Greek, languages they supposedly did not know. However, some skeptics noted that the Latin was often grammatically incorrect and that Greek was basically unintelligible. Fact 3, the symptoms began when the nuns were completely isolated during the plague epidemic. Fact 4, when the Archbishop of Bordeaux ordered the nuns to be separated, the symptoms temporarily subsided. Fact 5, Urbain Grandier never confessed, neither under extreme torture nor at the time of his death. Fact 6, the possessions continued for 4 years after Grandier's execution. Fact 7, multiple exorcists suffered mental breakdowns after participating in the case. Those are the facts. Now, how do we interpret them? The investigations of the time. Even in the 17th century, there were skeptics who questioned the case. Show documents if available. Mark Duncan, a Scottish Calvinist physician living in nearby Saumur, wrote that the nuns were neither possessed nor deliberately lying. In his opinion, they suffered from error of the imagination, essentially, a form of autosuggestion intensified by fasting, vigils, and solitary religious life. Duncan had to flee France to avoid being arrested for expressing this opinion. François Gayet de Pitaval, writing a century later, proposed that nuns suffered from nymphomania and hysteria, medical terms of the time that basically meant repressed sexual frustration. But the most interesting opinion came from the Sorbonne, the most prestigious theological university in France. In 1610, 24 years before Grandier's trial, a committee of theologians had issued a resolution on cases of possession. The accusation of demons should never be admitted, nor should exorcisms be exploited to determine whether a man is a sorcerer, since the devil is always the father of lies. In other words, demons cannot be trusted to testify in court, because demons are liars by nature. Grandier's trial and execution directly violated this theological resolution. But when Cardinal Richelieu wants someone to die, theological rules are negotiable. So what really happened in Loudun? After nearly 4 centuries, historians, psychologists, theologians, and skeptics have proposed numerous theories. Let's examine them all. Theory 1, genuine demonic possession. The perspective of believers. If you accept the existence of the supernatural, the Loudun case meets all the criteria for demonic possession established by the Catholic Church. Xenoglossia, speaking in unknown languages, Latin, Greek. Supernatural strength. Witnesses reported that the nuns exhibited enough strength to overpower several adult men. Hidden knowledge. The nuns allegedly revealed secrets they shouldn't know. Aversion to the sacred, violent reactions to religious objects. Furthermore, there are elements that are difficult to explain materially. The marks that appeared on Jean's hands. The synchronization of symptoms among multiple nuns. The mental breakdown of the exorcists, especially Ursuline. The continuation of the possessions after Grandier's death. Weak points. The main problem with this theory is everything else. If the nuns were genuinely possessed, why did the symptoms disappear when they were separated? Why was the Latin they spoke grammatically incorrect? Why would the demons specifically accuse Richelieu's political enemies? Why would God allow an innocent man to be burned alive based on demonic testimony? And perhaps the most important question, why would demons cooperate with exorcists by producing evidence when ordered to do so? Theory 2, Collective Hysteria/Mass Psychogenic Illness. The modern psychological perspective. This is the preferred explanation of contemporary historians and psychologists. And it makes perfect sense when you consider the context. Think about the conditions. 17 young women, average age, 25 years. Locked up in a convent, many against their will. Completely isolated during a plague epidemic that killed nearly 4,000 people. Without regular contact with the outside world. Led by a woman, Jean, with childhood trauma, physical disability, and documented sexual frustration. Mass hysteria, or as it is now called, mass psychogenic illness, is a real and documented phenomenon. It occurs when a group of people, usually in closed and stressful environments, begin to exhibit physical symptoms without an organic cause. Modern examples include the Tanganyika laughing outbreak of 1962, lasted for months. Multiple cases of mass fainting in factories. The case of the Tourette teenagers who contracted symptoms through TikTok in 2021. In all these cases, the symptoms are real, people genuinely experience them, but they are caused by psychological stress and social contagion, not by physical or supernatural factors. Evidence in favor. The symptoms began during extreme isolation and stress, the plague. They were infected from one nun to another. They decreased when they were separated. The nuns were young, sexually repressed, and in an environment of high religious suggestion. Public exorcisms likely reinforced the behaviors. The weak point. This theory explains the nuns' symptoms, but it doesn't easily explain. 20-year meltdown, Hysteria 2. The deaths of other exorcists. Some of the most extreme phenomena reported. Theory 3, Deliberate political conspiracy. The historical perspective. Most modern historians agree on one thing: Grandier's trial was a political farce. The evidence is overwhelming. Grandier was a direct enemy of Richelieu. Laubardement, the researcher, was a relative of Jean d'Angers. The lead prosecutor was Louis Trinquant, whose daughter Grandier had seduced. Many of the exorcists were Capuchin friars whom Grandier had offended. The royal decree made it illegal to question the case. This was not a trial. It was an execution with additional steps. But here's the tricky question: does this mean that the possessions were also deliberately manufactured? Some historians believe so. That Jean d'Angers, with the help of exorcists, faked the possessions from the beginning to destroy Grandier. In her autobiography, Jean admitted to being an expert at faking states of ecstasy and rapture. She admitted to using flattering and manipulative behavior to get what she wanted. But if it was all a deliberate act, why did the possessions continue for 4 years after the execution? Grandier was already dead. The conspiracy had succeeded. Why continue the deception? And if Jean was lying, what about the other 16 nuns? Were they all in on the conspiracy? Or did some of them genuinely believe they were possessed? Theory 4, Hybrid, a mixture of everything. Personally, I think the most likely explanation is all of the above. Simultaneously. Here is my interpretation. Step 1, Genuine hysteria. The nuns, isolated during the plague, led by Jean with her own traumas, began to experience genuine collective hysteria. Their symptoms were real for them. Step 2, Political manipulation. Grandier's enemies, especially Mignon and Trinquant, saw an opportunity. They turned the possessions into public exorcisms and began to suggest that Grandier was the culprit. Step 3, Reinforced autosuggestion. Once the idea was planted, the nuns, already in a highly suggestible state, began to remember and reveal more details about Grandier. Their minds filled in the gaps. Step 4, Political escalation. Richelieu saw an opportunity to eliminate an enemy. The case became a matter of state. Step 5, Conscious and unconscious acting. Over time, the nuns likely began to consciously exaggerate their symptoms. But they also continued to experience genuine episodes of hysteria. The line between acting and reality blurred. Step 6, Guilt and continuation. After Grandier was executed, the nuns, especially Jean, were trapped. If they admitted they had lied, they would be responsible for the death of an innocent man. So they carried on, until they were gradually able to heal without admitting the fraud. This theory explains the real symptoms of nuns, hysteria. Grandier's specific accusation, political manipulation. The continuation after execution, guilt and the need to maintain the story. Surin's breakdown, extreme guilt for participating in an injustice. The deaths of other exorcists, also blamed. The mysteries that remain. But even with this hybrid theory, there are things we cannot fully explain. The marks on Jean's hands, self-harm with acid. Psychosomatic stigmata. Ink fraud. Nobody knows for sure. Surin's 20 years of torment, was it really guilt? Or something more? The exact synchronization of symptoms among multiple nuns at the same time. Some of the most extreme physical phenomena reported by credible witnesses. And perhaps, that is the lesson of the Loudun case. Not all stories have complete and satisfactory explanations. Sometimes, the truth lies somewhere in the gray area between the psychological, the political, the social, and perhaps, just perhaps, the genuinely inexplicable. What does this case tell us? The case of the possessed girls of Loudun is many things at the same time. It is a warning about political power disguised as religious authority. It is a study on how the human mind can create physical realities from psychological trauma. It is a tragedy about an innocent man destroyed by his enemies. And it's a reminder that, even with all our modern science and skepticism, there are aspects of the human experience that we don't fully understand. Were the nuns victims or perpetrators? Probably both. Was Grandier completely innocent? Of witchcraft, yes. Of other behaviors, not so much. Was it all political, or was there something genuinely paranormal? Perhaps we'll never know. What we do know is this. In 1632, a group of young women confined in a convent began to experience something. Call it possession, call it hysteria, call it psychological trauma manifesting physically. Powerful men decided to use that suffering to destroy an enemy. A man was tortured and executed based on testimonies that violated the church's own theological rules. And when it was all over, no one was held responsible. The exorcists continued their careers. Jean became a celebrity. The politicians consolidated their power. Except for those who participated directly and afterwards could not live with what they had done. There is a reason why this case has fascinated generations for almost 4 centuries. It's not just the mystery of whether the possessions were real. It's what it tells us about human nature. On how faith can be used as a weapon. On how fear can turn ordinary people into accomplices to atrocities. On how the mind can create realities that defy explanation. And perhaps, about how at the intersection of trauma, politics, religion, and isolation, things can emerge that we genuinely don't know how to categorize. Demonic possession. Mass hysteria. Political conspiracy. The honest answer is, I don't know. And anyone who tells you they know for sure, is probably lying. What I can tell you is that the documents exist. The testimonies exist. The deaths occurred. And the questions remain. If this story intrigued you as much as it did me, let me know in the comments. What do you think really happened in Loudun? Were the nuns victims of genuine demonic possession? Mass hysteria? A deliberate political conspiracy? Or something we can't easily categorize? And perhaps more importantly, can something be multiple things at the same time? If you'd like me to investigate more historical cases of possession, exorcisms, or documented paranormal phenomena, let me know. This type of in-depth research takes time, but if you enjoyed this format, I'll do more. Like this post if you learned something new today. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. And share it with someone who enjoys a good mystery. All my sources are listed in the description, including books, historical documents, and academic analyses. If you really want to delve into this case, start with Aldous Huxley's *The Devils of Loudun Star. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey into one of the most disturbing and complex cases in history. And remember, reality is often stranger than fiction. See you next time.